Hi everyone, and welcome to today's seminar hosted by the International Inequalities Institute at LSE. My name is Michael Vaughan, and I'm a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow here at the III. I'm really pleased today to be chairing today's seminar titled How do Social Policies Unequally Restrict Reproduction Among Specific Populations, which is part of the II Inequalities seminar series. And today's speaker is Dr. Laura Sochas. Laura is a Chancellor's Fellow and Leverhulme Early Career Research Fellow at the University of Edinburgh. Her research focuses on how power, institutions and social policies affect health inequalities using mixed methods. As usual, there'll be a chance for you to pose questions following the presentation. So during the presentation, minor clarifications are okay, but please do keep some standard questions to the end. And we'll take questions both from in-person and online audience. I'll now hand over to Laura.
Thank you so much. And yeah, thanks to the International Inequalities Institute for inviting me to speak. Okay, let's get started. There we go. All right, so I'm going to start by introducing the topic in a way to sort of try to persuade you that reproduction is intensely political. It might be something that you're already convinced of, or you might so far have been thinking of it as something that has more to do with maybe gender inequalities or more in the private sphere. But really, here, the sort of purpose of the talk and really the sort of broader theme is how states intervene on reproduction for specific goals. And then subsequently to that, I'm going to introduce you to the theory and activist praxis of reproductive justice, which was proposed by African-American feminists in the early 1990s. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how through this Leverhulme project, I've been working on developing a quantitative approach to thinking with the theory of reproductive justice. And finally, I'm going to show you how I've applied this approach in an empirical paper, which is about austerity in England. So really hardly a day goes by, maybe even like especially recently, without some sort of news story about reproduction, both in terms of anxieties around overall levels of fertility. So in Europe, governments are concerned that fertility rates are too low, but also in terms of whose reproduction is valued. So for example, this Indigenous woman in Denmark had her baby taken away following a Danish parental competency test that's been shown to be particularly sort of racist policy. There's, of course, it's been instrumentalized by the extreme right, including the Reform Party in the UK, and also sort of speaking to sort of deeper anxieties around how, in the current cost of living crisis, is it possible for even middle-class people to have the children that. And so really, population can be thought of as an object of governance and something that governments and states really have controlled throughout history and still today. And when we think about intervening in populations, very simply, that might mean intervening on population size. So one is trying to create a smaller population or a larger population, or indeed population composition. So maybe population composition in terms of age, but also things that are a lot more problematic, like population composition in terms of religion, ethnicity, class. And really, demographers, of which I am one, will tell you there's only 3 ways you can change a population, and that's through deaths, births, and migration. And births really is what my work focuses on and what this talk is going to be about today. So Nira Yuval Davis, back in the 90s, created a typology of nationalist discourses around population control. And she observed that there were three discourses. So people as power, where the imagined problem is that we have too few people and we need to have more people. A Malthusian discourse where the perceived problem is that there's too many people and we need to have fewer people. And then the eugenicist discourse where the problem, again, an imagined problem, is that we have too many of these people relative to those people. And I've added a number of both historical and slightly more contemporary examples that really fit into each of those discourses. So the point here really is to convince you that states have and still do really take actions that align with these kinds of population control discourses. Okay. So these past examples are perhaps the most well-known examples, and they tend to focus on either military interventions or the coercive application of reproductive healthcare technologies, apart perhaps from the point in Armenia where it already tends towards social policies. But really, social policy is also a key way of intervening in reproduction. So first of all, social policy was absolutely part of what eugenicists in the early 20th century also wanted to influence. So here we have a quote from Ronald Fisher's book from 1932. So Ronald Fisher was a statistician, a biologist, a geneticist, and he was also a very fierce eugenicist who believed that we should control population, we should discourage reproduction amongst working class people, people who he believed didn't have a sufficiently high level of intelligence, or even racialized minorities. And that we should encourage reproduction amongst the kinds of people that he thought were superior in society. And so here he suggests a very sort of straightforward social policy, family policy that would further those aims. So providing an allowance for each child, not according to whether families need this allowance in order to provide their children with the resources to grow up healthily and happily, but on the contrary, providing an allowance that would be higher for richer families who he thought were superior. Now, this seems extremely shocking to us today, but there's really a lot of reverberations of this kind of thinking today. And for example, it would be really difficult, I believe, to find a pronatalist government or pronatalist social policy that was ever truly inclusive. So a pronatalist policy that really applies to everyone, regardless of who they are. I would like to see it, and I think it's harder to find than you might think. Some very sort of easy examples, of course, is Hungary's Viktor Orban promoting policies of procreation, not immigration. That's one of the most pronatalist or famously pronatalist European countries today. But even countries like France, which has been described as particularly pronatalist, those pronatalist family policy reforms occurred in the 1970s, and as Lim describes in their book, excluded actually its Antillean territories, even though the Antilles are a fully fledged département. We're also looking at this in the scope of my Leverhulme with Susanna Dansekova and Rosala Ciccia. So looking at child benefits and parental leave policies across all European countries, and looking specifically not just at generosity levels, but how these policies include and exclude people on the basis of their labor market participation and on the basis of residence and sort of migration status. So I would definitely argue that welfare reforms in general, like austerity, that sever the link between entitlements, so welfare entitlements, and the underlying need. So for example, by implementing family caps, one example of this being the two-child limit in the UK, those kinds of reforms frame the children of people receiving welfare benefits as undue burdens on the state, right? So it's trying to sever that link between entitlement and need in ways that are not the same as what Fisher was arguing for, but really I would argue on the same scale, not the same scale, on the same on a continuum, I would say. So the topic of the empirical paper that I'm going to talk about later in the talk addresses this explicitly and points out that the UK Conservative Party justified the 2010 austerity policies by blaming working class families' irresponsible childbearing choices. And today, as you saw in some of the news clippings that I put up at the start, the Reform Party is instrumentalizing the unaffordability of parenting for white working class families in the UK, while of course protesting immigration. And similarly, Spain's extreme right Vox Party has recently launched a national family response group to protest the loss of indigenous Spaniards as a consequence of Spain's low fertility rate. So, this attention to how reproductive governance is both unequally applied across different intersectional communities and population groups, and also how this reproductive governance goes beyond restricting negative rights, so the right to be free of direct state interference, but also restricts positive rights to resources, has been strongly informed by the theory and activist claims of reproductive justice. And so, as I said at the start, reproductive justice is a Black feminist, activist, and scholarly framework originating in the United States, which articulates new rights and a new conception of justice that goes beyond more mainstream white feminist conceptions of reproductive rights. So, for example, where the latter really focuses on the right to not have a child and therefore the right to access contraception and abortion, reproductive justice imagines the right we have in a way that's much more expansive, to also include the right to have a child and the right to parent children in safe and healthy environments. And when you think about it from a sort of standpoint theory perspective, that makes a lot of sense, because these scholars and activists, being African American and given the history of oppression in the United States, have a lot more direct experience of social policies or state action that limits these rights relative to this right, which is a more sort of white feminist experience, I would say. Okay. So in going into more detail, reproductive justice demands positive rights. And that means that it demands of the state the kind of local support structures and services that enable individuals and communities to freely make reproductive decisions. So that might look like access to healthcare, education, housing, transport, social infrastructure, healthy environments. All of these underpin the necessary conditions for unconstrained decision-making regarding to whether or not to have more children. Importantly, as I was sort of referring to earlier, explicit attacks on these principles, and particularly the right to have children and the right to parent in safe and healthy environments, has targeted intersectional communities characterized by poverty, migration status or migration experience, and sort of negative racialization, because these communities' reproduction is seen as less valued or even seen as dangerous. And I think this focus on communities is particularly important. So when we think about the more traditional white feminist conception of reproductive rights, we tend to frame it as the sort of free choice, right, about whether or not to have a child or maybe, and it tends to be framed as an individual right. And while reproductive justice certainly believes in individual rights, it also positions this idea that communities have rights as well. And that's because when you think about reproductive governance politically, this reproductive governance is really targeted at specific communities. And I think it's important to point this out because, for example, when I gave a tiny sort of presentation around my Leverhulme project to the Leverhulme funder who came to Edinburgh to chat to our university about what we were doing with funds. And afterwards, the sort of head of research for Leverhulme came to me and was like, I'm not sure we really have those rights. I don't think everyone really does have the right to have a child. And I could kind of see what he meant. Like, I think he meant, okay, well, maybe he meant we don't all have the right to like free IVF, for example. But when I explained that really this right is positioned in communities and in resistance to community-based reproductive oppression, he suddenly seemed a lot more convinced. So this is why I'm sort of pointing this out now. And then the last very important reproductive justice principle is this focus on intersectionality in terms as a lens to understand how oppression functions in practice and how it's the consequence of these mutually reinforcing and mutually defined power inequalities in society. And so with my co-author Jenny Chancellor, we took the opportunity to think about how one might go about using the principles of reproductive justice or thinking with reproductive justice while using quantitative research methods, because to date, RJ has really been applied either in conceptual ways or in qualitative ways. And the way we sort of engage with it here is really by focusing on social policies as key independent variables, as potential constraints on reproductive freedom and reproductive justice. And in doing so, we try to take a more comprehensive lens. So because reproductive justice really emphasizes how people are parenting and making decisions within broad environments, we're really trying, instead of identifying the impact of a specific policy, we're trying to focus more, to have a more comprehensive outlook. And really trying to capture environment systems and regimes instead of specific policy levers. Again, so the focus on communities invites a multi-level analysis. And in our empirical paper, which I'm about to go into, we conceptualize communities as both spatial and intersectionally social. And then lastly, this focus on intersectionality is important because unlike a more traditional reproductive rights approach, it's really taking us out of an exclusive focus on gender inequality to also consider class, race, and other elements of oppression and power inequalities. And as I'm about to demonstrate in this empirical paper, I think it's also important not to just consider intersectional marginal effects, so heterogeneous effects according to these intersectional identities, but also think about who is exposed to these constraining environments or these constraining social policies, and who's excluded from social policies that seek to encourage reproduction. So thinking about intersectionality a little bit more broadly and not just through heterogeneous effects. Okay, so this is the paper I'm about to discuss. It's currently in the publication process, fingers crossed. And this links to the working paper version. So this is a first draft, and it's changed quite a bit since then. But this has the sort of basics. Okay. So as I was discussing previously, this paper is about austerity in the UK and whether it's unequally affected people's ability to have children. So for some of you in the room, I don't know, might be new to the UK, I'm just going to point out that austerity started in 2010 with an election that saw the formation of a right and centre coalition between the Tories and the Liberal Democrats. And this austerity program involved very large cuts to national level benefits, but the hardest hit government department was the Ministry of Local Government, something that I didn't know actually before starting to work on this paper. And interestingly, also tragically, the architects of austerity have themselves implied that some people's reproduction has less value. So austerity has been discursively justified by claiming that benefits producing extra births is a concern. So CSJ is a very poorly named right-wing think tank, co-founded by Ian Duncan Smith, who was the architect of benefit cuts, because he was the head of DWP between 2010 and 2016. Also discursively justified austerity by claiming that poor families have children in order to receive benefits, and also that poverty is caused by poor parenting. So this is the sort of political discourse that these policies were being, in the midst of which these policies were being implemented. And so Sarah Mary Hall, who's a professor of geography at Manchester, has done incredible work on this theme qualitatively. And she's interviewed parents in the northeast of the UK, which is an area that's particularly suffered from austerity cuts and coincidentally also has one of the lowest fertility rates in the UK. And she shows through her work that for many young adults in the UK, austerity restricted capacities to access secure housing, employment, social welfare, in ways that also interacted with personal debt, and that all of this had sharp implications for how people imagined their reproductive futures. And I really highly recommend these two papers. They're some of the best work, social science work that I've ever read. They're extremely moving and instructive. Okay, so how does this topic relate to previous quantitative literature? So because most sort of European policy priorities are around how can we increase the fertility rate, a lot of the quantitative literature focuses on the effect on fertility of increasing public spending for families, and also slightly relatedly focuses on the effect of recessions on fertility. So the literature on the effect of reducing family benefits for fertility is a lot more constrained, but we can see, so these few papers here, including Erin Reeves and Mary Reeder's work in the second bullet point here, and they usually find either no impact of reducing family benefits or fairly limited impacts. But the key thing to note is that these papers focus on single policy. So they're really isolating the effect of that policy and looking at the effect of that policy on benefit claimants specifically. So the contribution of this paper then is, as I was saying before, qualitative scholars have linked austerity to reproductive justice and strongly implied, without, of course, quantitatively testing, that this has had unequal impacts on people's freedom to have the number of children that they want. And so this paper, for the first time, then uses larger data sets in ways that aspire to generalizability within the UK anyway, in order to test the possibility that the constraining support for the right to parent in safe and healthy environments actually has consequences for the right to have children, so framed within this reproductive justice theory. Secondly, most reproductive justice research has been about abortion and contraception. And so through focusing on a social policy here, this paper aims to bring a different lens on a traditional reproductive rights topic. And then finally, because the literature on RJ to date has been primarily qualitative and theoretical, we believe that quantitative evidence on this topic could also contribute to reproductive justice activism. Okay. So this is a research question, and just to give you some information on the setup of this paper and the context that is informing our analytical strategy. At the start of austerity, so before they started cutting local government spending, local government accounted for 27% of total government spending, which is, I feel, a really high proportion. You know, you think local government, it's not that important. Actually, it's contributing almost a third of total government spending at the start of the period in the UK. Second point, there were really large cuts in local government spending, so almost 30% of cuts, which resulted from cuts to the central government grant to local authorities. So part of that cut, which was almost 50%, was able to be offset by local authorities, but not all, and presumably richer local authorities were able to offset the cut to the central government grant much better than poorer ones. And lastly, and importantly, there were large variations then in the extent of local authority spending cuts ranging from between 5% and 45%. So interestingly, local government spending cuts were concentrated in universal services, and that's just because most local government services, apart from adult social care, are universal. And of course, the cuts were concentrated on non-statutory services. So non-statutory services are services that local authorities are not legally responsible for providing. And of course, given the fact that, for example, they still had to continue funding children's social care. So that means, for example, taking kids into foster care, that is a statutory responsibility. Cuts were then focused in on anything that was non-statutory. In the context of this paper, we interpret local authority spending cuts as a decrease in support for the right to parent in safe and healthy environments. And that's because these cuts affected all of these services, which hopefully you'll agree are important for the sort of context and communities in which people parent and make decisions about whether to have kids or not. And there's some indications there about what the funding cuts what the implications were of these funding cuts for actual services. And you can get more information here. So we interpret unequal effects on childbearing by income as reproductively unjust. Now, I need to tell you a little bit more about this because reproductive justice as a framework is agnostic about whether a higher or lower probability of having a birth is good or bad, right? Reproductive justice in itself doesn't care about that. It cares about your fertility intentions. So whether you're having the children you want or you're not having the children that you don't want. But here, we don't include fertility intentions in our analysis. And that's partly because data on fertility intentions is only available in a couple ways in the data set that we're using. But second, because the reliability of fertility intentions is strongly contested. When you ask someone, do you intend to have a birth in the next 3 years? It's really unclear whether they're taking into account structural conditions when they're answering that question or not. So we don't take into account fertility intentions, but we argue that there is no logical explanation that we haven't controlled for that could explain unequal effects on childbearing across local authorities and by income category in a way that would be consistent with reproductive justice. And let's see if you agree by the end of the talk. So this is just to give you a visual of the extent of local government spending cuts. Each line is a local authority in the UK. And here you can see that the extent of the spending cuts were really concentrated on areas of higher deprivation. And that's because essentially the mechanism for making the cuts was really again, severing this link between entitlement and need in terms of local government spending. So I'm using data sources on spending and then linking them to individual data. So on the spending data side, I'm using two data sets. The first is a data set that was kindly made available to me by the Institute of Fiscal Studies. And what's great about this data set is that they did a lot of the work in terms of harmonization over time and across different kinds of local authorities in the UK. The challenge with that is that it excludes some key things, including Sure Start and services for young people, which we would think would be particularly important for a parenting environment. Therefore, I also use section R03, which is information data on local authority spending for local children's services. And here, importantly, I focus on non-punitive and / non-statutory spending. So I don't include any spending here on children being taken into care. And by the way, spending on that increased during austerity for obvious reasons that parents could no longer afford to take care of their children. And so many more children had to be taken into care. So that kind of spending is, I would argue, reproductively unjust and in any case not included here. Okay, so in terms of methods, I'm using a within between random intercepts model at the local authority level within a linear probability model. So the important thing to note here is that the within estimator in yellow is asymptomatically equivalent to a fixed effects estimator in an OLS model. So just like a fixed effects model, we're controlling for time invariant local authority characteristics. And we can discuss more later on about why I prefer this to a fixed effects model. Part of it is that it has these kinds of estimates have smaller mean square error than fixed effects models in small samples. Okay, so the sample is women of reproductive age. I included a range of individual controls, all of which were lagged by one wave in order to try and capture the kinds of conditions that were at play at the time of conception. So these are pretty normal ones around number of children up until that point, duration since previous birth or since menarche for people who haven't yet had a child, age, marital status. I exclude social economic status controls because I'm really interested in the heterogeneous effects of spending cuts by income, and I want to capture that effect for people within those income categories as they are socially in all their complexity, if that makes sense. I'm not trying to specifically isolate income as being different from housing tenure, household employment rate, or racialized category. But I have sensitivity analyses that do include this, and I can show you that if you want. And then importantly, of course, the within effects model does control for time invariant characteristics at the local authority level, but not for time varying controls. So I include these controls at the local authority level. And these are really important in the sense that, as you've already been thinking, I'm sure, cuts to local government spending were in no way random, right? They correlated with lots of other things, and in particular, spatial and economic disadvantage. I don't include the local authority unemployment rate in the main model, but it's a key sensitivity test. And I'm going to speak a little bit later on about why I separated out, mainly because it's on the causal pathway, unfortunately. But it's also, it's self a cause just because austerity is a consequence of recession, right? Or that's how it's been framed. Okay, so descriptively, we have these trends here. So these trends control for the individual characteristics of the sample, and that's it. And you can see there's been a substantial decrease in the probability of giving birth over this period, in particular for the poorest tercile in blue, but not as much for the middle or richest tercile. There's no direct evidence of this because the confidence intervals overlap so much, but potentially we're also seeing some potential reversal of the previous class gradient in terms of the probability of having a birth. So let's look at the role that local government spending cuts might have played in this trend. So this is the main graph, the main result. And you can see that spending cuts were only significantly associated with a decrease in the probability of having a birth for the poorest category, so here and here. Now, just briefly, I want to say that these are two separate models and that it's important to show them side by side because they capture slightly different things, but they should not be compared. And that's because they overlap slightly in terms of what they're capturing, but more importantly, the spending was cut at the same time for the same reason. So it's very difficult to consider that these could ever be independent, even when you control for one kind of spending in the other model, which I don't do here. So what does this sort of negative marginal effect for the poorest category actually mean in terms of scale of impact? Well, so these are very, very small numbers, but if you consider that the mean percentage decrease in total council spending over the entire period was about 23.9%, it sort of adds up to the probability of having a birth for the poorest being predicted to have declined from 7.7% to 7% over the period. And that's the probability of having a birth in a given wave, I should add, which is equivalent to a 9% decrease. The other thing I should note, sorry, is that I'm showing within effects only in this graph. So between effects are controlled for, but they weren't as interesting as I was hoping for. So I've just focused on the within effects. So what happens when we control for local authority unemployment? As I mentioned before, austerity was a response to recession, and the depths of local recessions might have been correlated with the depths of local spending cuts because local governments would have drawn on their own very limited tax-raising powers to try and offset the cuts in the central government grants. So I'm only adding this in sensitivity analysis because a big way in which local governments cut spending in practice was by cutting local council jobs. And women would have been the ones most affected by these local spending cuts. And so in this way, local authority unemployment is both antecedent to spending cuts and also on the causal pathway between spending cuts and childbearing decisions. So it's slightly complicated. We can see that even though we lose a bit of significance here, the sort of the effect, the sort of level of the effect barely changes. For children's services spending, it doesn't lose significance. So I would consider that our results are not invalidated by this. That said, it's probably very difficult in real to completely disentangle the effects of spending cuts from the changes in unemployment over this period. And I think that we are not completely able to do so. So we just have to accept that the effects that we're seeing are reflective of the broader macroeconomic trends that were also happening at this time. Some of it is probably a large part, I believe, is due to spending cuts. Some of it might also be due to local recessions. So another thing you might be thinking is whether this entire analysis is just capturing cuts in national benefits. And that's because the places that experienced larger funding cuts were the same places that are likely to have a higher proportion of benefit claimants, right? Because you saw in that initial descriptive graph that places that had higher levels of deprivation experienced much stronger funding cuts. Now, this is not actually as big of a problem as you might think, because we're looking at effects within income terciles, but it could still be a problem if there's a larger proportion of national benefit claimants amongst the poorest tercile in high deprivation local authorities relative to low deprivation local authorities. And that's totally possible. So this is why we estimated this. So we're estimating the percentage of people in the poorest terciles within each local authority who are claiming benefits. And we're doing this based on the individual UK household longitudinal survey data. So the data we're using in the rest of this paper, rather than administrative data, because administrative data is not broken down by income. So as shown in this figure, there was no statistically significant relationship between the share of people claiming benefits here on the x-axis and the extent of the cuts on the y-axis. So I think we're safe on this in terms of this alternative explanation. Another thing that people have brought up a lot when we were presenting this paper initially is, well, what about if austerity limited access to contraception and abortion? What kind of implications would that have for your results? If there actually was an effect of austerity on lower access to contraception and abortion, we would here be underestimating the true consequences of austerity for reproductive justice, in the sense that some people would have wanted to limit their childbearing, but would in practice have been unable to do so because they couldn't access the kind of reproductive health care that they needed. However, we don't think this is a very likely mechanism because contraception and abortion are free of charge in the UK. There wasn't any negative change in abortion provision over the period. There was a change in who was responsible for contraception during this period, but actually the spending on contraception declined only by 6%. So yeah. Maybe there was a little bit of this. So LARCs are long-acting reversible contraception. So there's things like the IUD, the implant, injections, and these kinds of contraception are deployed again in a sort of very strongly reproductive governance-y ways, and over this period, we're being pushed particularly strongly on women that the government didn't think would be able to raise children. So women who were in more deprived areas, were minoritized, racially minoritized, and were young. So that could have been a little bit of an effect there, but not particularly strong, I believe. Okay, so what about intersectional effects? So far we've really focused on class, but reproductive justice encourages us to look at how these things intersect with other power inequalities, and race is a big part of that. So the way in which we looked at this, first of all, was through looking at exposure to these cuts in an intersectional way. So it's no surprise to you, probably looking at this, that racially minoritized categories in the UK are overall overrepresented amongst the poorest categories and underrepresented in the richest category. So of course we have here some sort of interaction, obviously, between class and race. What's really interesting, and what I absolutely did not expect when I started looking at this, is that racially minoritized categories had completely different levels of exposure to funding cuts. And in fact, the differences in exposure between racialized categories is much larger than the difference in exposure between class categories within racialized categories. So hopefully you can see that easily, even though there's some missing lines here. But for white people, for example, the extent of spending cuts hovered around 20%. For Black people, hovering around 30%. Same for Indian racialized category. Even stronger for Pakistani or Bangladeshi racialized categories, ranging from 30 to 36%. Now, these are quite small samples because I'm estimating this based on people who were interviewed in 2019 only. So they're not, I wouldn't claim at all that this is representative, but I think it is indicative. And so what happens then when you apply the same marginal effect that we estimated before for the poorest category for the entire population, but thinking about how that marginal effect, that same marginal effect would play out differently according to the level of exposure to spending cuts amongst the poorest within each of these racialized categories, and taking into account the baseline probability of having a birth for these people. We conclude that, and this again, so this is very much a simulation because we're not calculating intersectional marginal effects, but if the same marginal effect held, we see massively different sort of scales of effect because of this difference in exposure. We did, of course, calculate intersectional marginal effects, but we found quite confusing results that were all over the place. I have that graph at the back of this presentation that you can see, but our reviewers were of the opinion that we didn't really have enough sample sizes to make very strong claims on that. So we've taken it away from the paper. And I completely agree with them, actually. Okay, so in conclusion, we argue that this paper provides new evidence on the fertility effects of austerity policies and really has implications for reproductive justice in the sense that we try to argue that this shows that restricting people's rights to parent in safe and healthy environments leads to constraints on the right to have a child. This paper didn't look at mechanisms at all. Of course, it's arguing that we're observing a direct effect of sort of restricted parenting environments, but lots of other mechanisms here could be at play. So in the same way that the deaths of despair operate, so most of you are probably familiar with that literature, but I can tell you that in the Q&A, if not, is this this literature that shows that in deindustrialized places that have been hit by austerity, particularly in the United States, there was an increase in mortality rates amongst white working class middle-aged men. And the sociological explanation for this was this rise in hopelessness and anomie, this idea that the community, they felt like the community was dying and that they didn't have any way out. So there's also these sorts of other more psychosocial mechanisms that could be at play as well. And I think we're also unable, of course, to completely disentangle the effect of austerity from what is really enmeshed and interacting with in practice, such as structural labor market change to also reflect the deaths of despair literature, but also things like personal debt, etc. So a lot of things here that I'm interested in looking at further in my next research agenda. And lastly, I leave you with reflections of James Bowman, who is an American medical geneticist and bioethicist. And he illustrates passive eugenics as the systematic denial of healthcare to poor and minoritized Americans, including voting against welfare relief for children, and warns that a society that counterbalances passive eugenics provides fertile ground for both clandestine and overt active eugenics, and so that we should be potentially concerned about this. So thank you very much for your attention, really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Laura, for the presentation. So we're going to move to questions now. We can take questions online if people use the raise hand function or paste their question into the chat, stating your name and affiliation where possible. And Peter, if you can signal me if something comes up, but for now we'll start in the room.
Thank you, very interesting. I have two quick suggestions maybe, and then two questions also. As a suggestion, the first one, on the differences by groups that you have, I think it would be interesting to see. I'm not sure now if this was a relative or the absolute percentage point or percentage decrease, but it would probably be helpful to have both to be able to compare to because levels would also be different, I assume, by these groups.
Yeah.
And then I think it would also be interesting to show if you see, or maybe you have done this but didn't show it, for who is in charge of the local governments, basically, in terms of party affiliation, for example, in independence. And then two questions. So one clarification, this graph was all the blue dots that you had there. I didn't quite understand that. In particularly, why are we seeing these suggested lines here at 0.5, at 0, at 1? I couldn't quite make sense of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so at 0.5, you see there's like, so why is there so many that have exactly 50%, it seems, you know, you see that often in self-reports, something like this, but I was assuming this is admin data, and so that
That's a good point.
surprised me.
That is surprising. I don't actually have a good answer for that. Yeah,
Right.
the lines at 0 and 1 surprised me a bit less, but I agree that, yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you. I'll look into it. I wonder maybe if I took away the decimal points or something like this. Yeah. Good point.
And then one more overarching question, I guess. So I mean, at the beginning, you already hinted at, so in the, what was it, CSJ or something, there seems to have been, at least from the top, some thinking even about using austerity with a link to reproductive rights. And then also later on some of these slides, you did suggest that it was very targeted. So I'm just wondering, is there a bit more evidence on that this was actually also at the local area level, something really targeted and voluntary, or is it more a negligence and oversight, not of this evidence not being there, people not really simulating the effects of these things on different population groups, or maybe not caring? So it's just wondering if you have a bit more background basically on how much we think of this might actually have been something that they were trying to achieve with these targeted cuts of it. That was the story.
So that's a really good question. My colleague, Rebecca Hewer, has an incredible paper on the 2-child limit, and she calls it reproductive governance by gaslight. And the sort of argument of her paper is that because it's illegal to try and limit groups' reproduction in the UK, this government repeatedly denied that. So even, for example, the 2-child limit benefit cut, which is arguably a lot more, can be seen as much more targeted than these kinds of cuts. That policy was not found to be illegal by the higher courts, by the Constitutional Court, and yeah, but so I don't think, yeah, it's just a really hard question to answer. I don't think that people's reproduction was. There's like a lot of policy goals that are more justifiable, I guess. So for example, for the 2-child limit, some of the policy goals were getting low-income families into work, which did not happen. So the Large Families project that Erin Reeves was part of showed that empirically that was that did not happen. So it just made larger families poorer. I think it demonstrates a profound lack of care for some sections of the population. So whether they actually wanted this to happen or whether they really don't care is like a question I can't really answer, but maybe it doesn't matter.
Okay, so Callum.
Yes, thanks. Very interesting presentation. And I have a question that I fear should sound a criticism, but it's not. It's just a very basic question about the meaning of your exercise. So in the end, what you have shown at the beginning was a stark declining trend for lower income families in the probability of having children, which in the end make them similar to richer families in the end. So as economists, we tend to think that this could be a signal of no constraints or no other factors that make this choice unequal across income groups. So if we were looking only at the last picture, we would see, okay, there is no systematic difference of the number of children you end up having depending on your income. That's a good sign, no? But the narrative here is a different one, which is a bad sign. In fact, you even push this to claim that it's a form of is an aggressive form toward minorities, which may be the case. I don't question the interpretation, but the reason is that there was a starker decline, so the drop was. But my question is, why do they tend to have more children at the beginning of the period? Because I mean that's my understanding of how one should frame the problem. So I observe at the beginning of the period that a certain group tend to have more children. Why do they? I mean, there are many explanations, of course, but in the end, there is like an assumption in all. I mean, at least to my understanding of all what you have said, an underlying assumption that the initial equilibrium was the right one or was closer to the right one. While as an economist, when I observe such an imbalance, I tend to think, and knowing that the opportunity set, the choice open to less wealthy families is smaller, this decision that I observe is the result of something that went wrong or is wrong. So, I mean, I'm not claiming that it was wrong. I'm just saying that my initial perception would be that. So I was asking to you to shed light on all this mess that I...
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. Thank you. I'm going to try and engage with it. So the first thing to note is that levels of childbearing in themselves are not the concern, or basically that reproductive justice is agnostic about just levels of childbearing, right? So if we see differences in levels of childbearing between different income groups, you know, maybe those levels reflect genuine differences in cultures or in preferences or in, you know, views about what makes life worth living, right? So in itself, that's fine. The issue is when there seems to be an unequal effect of a constraining factor. So this is what we're trying to argue here. And let's say that, for example, there had been no relationship between local government spending cuts or austerity cuts and childbearing choices, or at least no heterogeneous effects. That would have told us, okay, well, these changes are happening for another reason. And in fact, one of the reviewers we had for this paper made the point, well, how do you know that what you're observing is to do with this, you know, differential cuts in spending at the local government level and not some sort of social emulation of working class fertility preferences relative to sort of upper class fertility preferences, right? Which is something that demographers also write about. And our point is that it's very, very, very unlikely that this sort of diffusion of innovation or emulation of fertility behaviors would have happened in a way that perfectly mirrors the cuts in local government spending. And so that's why we eliminate that as an explanation, for example. So I hope does that sort of answer your question?
No.
No, okay.
My question is, I mean, it's like if there was an assumption that at the beginning, before the beginning of the austerity, the equilibrium was sort of a positive one, and I don't understand why.
I don't think it was necessarily a positive one. I'm just saying it got worse.
Why do you think it got worse? I mean, how people
because we argue it got worse because we show that, or we show strong evidence for, even though it's not proving, that cuts in local government spending had an unequal negative association that was particularly strong for the lowest income. And this, in combination with a lot of qualitative work that describes how sort of reproductive futures were constrained, in working class communities across England as a consequence of austerity leads us to think that people would have wanted to have more children, but were unable to do so as a consequence of what was going on with local government spending.
I'm afraid I have to give Laura the final word on that because we've run out of time. But thank you so much for the presentation. Thank you everyone for joining us, and until next time.
Thank you.